Haviv Rettig Gur is a senior political correspondent and writer for the Times of Israel. He has been my guest a few times. He joins me this morning from Israel. I think he might be by the side of the road. Did you have car trouble this morning, Haviv?
A little bit of car trouble. Everything's okay.
Was it your fault or was it the other guy's fault?
Well, it's always the other guy's fault. What kind of a question is that to ask a person?
Now, the question, before I get to the question, in California, we have the best drivers in America, and in Boston, there are the worst drivers in America. How are Israelis generally as drivers?
I'm going to say something unabashedly racist. Israelis are terrible drivers. All of them, to the last one. Every ethnicity, every religion. If you're in any way related to Israel in any way, you're a bad driver.
All right, I thought as much. I've only been driven in Israel. I've not driven in Israel. Do you have roundabouts in Israel? Because that's what's the problem with New England. That's why Boston's terrible. They have roundabouts.
Absolutely, we do.
You see? I do not know. Yeah. It must have been a 1947 thing when you became a state. Someone must have decided to slow the development of the state of Israel down. Haviv, would you summarize for us the Israeli attitude writ large towards the present situation? By that, I mean, is it going to get worse before it gets better? Is it going to be a long grind ahead? Is there a deal in the offing that you think will be reached? What is the general Israeli attitude?
The general Israeli attitude is very simple. It's reflected in every poll for 3 months. Nothing really fundamental has changed. The general Israeli attitude is that Hamas has to be removed from Gaza. Hamas is making it extremely difficult to remove it from Gaza, and that is a terrible thing for Gaza. And nevertheless, Hamas will be removed from Gaza. There's a deal for our hostages. There are 136 hostages still in Hamas's hands, including children. And that is who Hamas is and who Hamas will forever be. And that is something that we are willing to trade. Some limited slowdown in the fighting. We're limited to trade. We're willing to trade some things that Hamas might want, the survival of its leadership so they can escape, things like that. We're not going to trade Hamas surviving in Gaza in exchange for those hostages. And that's where things have been, and that's where polls have been, and that's where the war effort really has been from day one.
Now, this morning I ran through the headlines in the variety of American papers and in the Israeli papers. Hamas due in Cairo for hostage talks. Prime Minister Netanyahu rules out ceasefire, mass prisoner releases. In other words, there's lots of speculation about what's going on. But as far as I can tell, Hamas has demanded a complete end to the war, so there isn't really a negotiation going on.
Yeah, that's what it demanded last time as well. In fact, at the very first week of the war, it demanded not starting the war in exchange for hostage release. It wanted to give us 1 or 2 a week for years so that we wouldn't start the war. To remove it from Gaza, we did. There was a decision made early on, back in October, by the Israeli High Command, led by the Defense Minister, Yoav Gallant, that the only way to get the hostages out is not to play Hamas's game, because Hamas will hold on to them for as long as they're useful. And so what's important is to make them less useful. And you do that by pushing Hamas militarily, pushing them so powerfully and quickly that the only way they survive, the only way they get a little bit of respite, a few days of quiet, is by releasing large numbers of hostages. That policy has already been vindicated massively in the last hostage release, where we got 90 Israelis and another roughly 40 non-Israelis out in exchange for 7 days of quiet. Israel is willing to have that again, obviously. They want to charge more this time because some of the hostages are soldiers and some of the Hamas also has to justify the sheer devastation it has brought on Gaza to Palestinians, to the Palestinian story. And so their price is very high. Israel will not stop the war. That is not something Israel is going to give. It is something Hamas is starting to demand. Last time it took about a month to get Hamas down off that tree. It might take a month to get them off that tree again.
Now, will Israel accept a deal that releases everyone except young men?
I don't know. One of the dividing lines, that one of the decisions that really have to be made is, do you agree to release murderers, people who have killed Jews, have killed children? Do you agree to release who are in Israeli prisons, who are part of the Hamas list of people demanded to be released? Who do you agree to release? How do you agree to release them? Where do they go? That's all part of the story. It's extremely unlikely that Hamas will give us all the hostages, because why would the leadership of Hamas, that is now hiding beneath some parts of Khan Yunis or in the southernmost Gazan city of Rafah? Why would they release the last insurance they have to survive, the last negotiating card they have to survive at the end of the war? So, we're talking about some of ours in exchange for some of theirs, and maybe some delay of the fighting in some way. Hamas right now is demanding immense things that are absolutely impossible for Israeli governments politically to give them. The Israelis will not accept an end to the war with Hamas in power. And so as long as that's the Hamas demand, there won't be a hostage exchange.
Yeah, I really don't believe we're going to see one. But one of the things I do believe between the lines is that Hamas is trying to keep back young Israeli women who are also in the IDF or served in the IDF. And I suspect they don't want to release them because of the way that they have been abused. Do you share that suspicion?
Well, that's a doozy, right? That is a fear shared by the Israeli intelligence services, and it is not just Israeli soldiers. It's not just Israeli female soldiers. It's just young Israeli women, including Muslim women. There is a young Bedouin woman, 18 years old. Hamas, we know she's with Hamas. We don't know where she is. And Hamas is not upfront about releasing her. And she's a Bedouin Arab Muslim woman who, when she was taken, was wearing a hijab. And so the fear for these women, the fear for women Hamas isn't eager to release, is that they are in a shape that will not make Hamas look good on the international stage, put it that way.
Well, I remember when ISIS seized the, was it Haredi? Not Haredi, an ethnic minority, Hazari. They seized the Hazari women, made them sex slaves, and then executed them.
The Yazidi, yeah.
Yeah, the Hazidi. So is that what we're worried about? Because it's what seems to me to be part of the negotiations that's in between the lines as I read the stories.
That has not been part of this conflict ever in the past. There has not been mass rape, mass sexual violence, not on the Israeli side, not on the Palestinian side. There's been a lot of other terrible things, but there's never been that. And now we have started to see that for the very first time. And so the simple answer I would have given you 3 months ago is no way. That's not a chance. It's simply not imaginable. That's not who we are. That's not who they. It's just never been. It's never been in our great wars with huge dislocation and a lot of people that we've never had that. And now we have. So the simple answer is I don't know. I don't know how far Hamas has fallen. I don't know how, what Palestinian civilian, in this particular case of these particular civilians, I put that in quotation marks, who kidnapped people and held them in their homes. I don't know how far they will have fallen. So the simple answer is we can't know.
We can't. Did we know that UNRWA was as corrupt? I mean, as completely infiltrated by Hamas as it's turned out to be? I hope they never get another dollar. But UNRWA has been revealed as an arm of Hamas. Did we know that before the war?
We knew that. Everybody knew that. Everybody understood that the tunnels were being dug with aid money and aid supplies and aid concrete. Everybody understood that you can't get a job with UNRWA. UNRWA has 13,000 employees in Gaza. Not one of them can get that job if Hamas doesn't want them to. So it's not, UNRWA doesn't even have to be infiltrated by Hamas. We think it is, but it doesn't have to be. It's simply operating under a dictatorship that understands that this UNRWA money, $1.2 billion a year, in an economy like Gaza's, that is a vast amount of money. That obviously the mafia that runs Gaza is going to make sure to control that spigot. I mean, how could it not? It's an insult to our intelligence ever to suggest that it isn't profoundly shaped and affected and infiltrated and controlled on the ground by Hamas. And UNRWA doesn't seriously argue it isn't. UNRWA has actually, we've seen videos of Hamas gunmen take UNRWA aid trucks as they go into Gaza. And UNRWA's official response is, oh, they're not stealing the trucks, they're helping the distribution and protecting the trucks from theft.
Well, Haviv, I'm not a dummy, and I followed this region pretty well. I always thought UNRWA, while perhaps paying off and paying a bit of bribery to Hamas, that they were not going to take up arms against Israel. I had a definitely shades on my eyes as to what they were. But they apparently were part of the killing spree. And that's different, right? That's when they've crossed the line from being useful idiots and accomplices to being terrorists. And they've done that.
Let me say, so the small problem, and it is the small problem, is that some number of UNRWA people, we have identified 13. We don't know if it isn't 60 or 300. We don't yet. I don't think it's 300, but certainly we've identified 13. It might be much more. The small problem is that these people actually participated as members of Hamas in the actual massacre of October 7th, in the kidnapping, in preparing places for the kidnapped people to go. They were just part of the atrocities of October 7th. That's the small problem. The large problem is that UNRWA allows Hamas to be the irresponsible guerrilla group it wants to be, while also being the government it wants to be at the same time. In other words, Hamas attacks and hides behind civilians. A lot of guerrilla groups have done that in history. But Hamas alone in the history of warfare is an irresponsible guerrilla group that hides behind civilians and also controls the territory and the government and the economy. And so it does it on a scale no one has ever done before in the history of warfare. And how can Hamas be a guerrilla group that bends an entire economy to building this underground network that is twice as large as the London tube system, and never actually be responsible for feeding and clothing and inoculating and teaching its population that it is the government of? And the answer is UNRWA. The great and big and gigantic problem and crime of UNRWA is the thing that it does that is so good on the face of it, but in fact allows Hamas to use all of Gaza as a military base and never actually be responsible for Gaza and place 2 million Gazans in harm's way. And that's literally its strategy for warfighting, because it's a guerrilla group, but it can do so with 2 million people because it doesn't have responsibility as a government. And the reason it doesn't have responsibility as a government is that UNRWA has replaced it as a government in Gaza.
When we come back from break, we're going to talk about the tunnels. UNRWA is done, and I believe they are finished forever, and it may be the beginning of the toppling of the UN. I do think a lot of Americans' eyes are wide open in a way that they've never been before to things like the United Nations Relief Agency for Gaza, which is one of a kind. It's been around since 1948. Got nothing to do with their bigger effort for refugees around the world. It is a mini-state within a terrorist state. And I think it's done after this. But Haviv will be right back. I'm going to talk to him off the air, then back on the air, then off the air. Don't go anywhere. It'll all be on the podcast later today. And I'll play portions of it that you don't hear on air. Don't go anywhere. I'm Hugh Hewitt. Welcome back, America. I'm talking with Haviv Rettig Gur of the Times of Israel. Haviv, I've also read conflicting stories on the amount of the tunnel system that has been destroyed. I've seen 20%. I've seen 50%. Yesterday, I saw a story that they've begun to pump in seawater. I saw the same story a month ago. What is your understanding about the tunnel system and its capacity, its operability right now?
The tunnel system is many different parts and pieces. A lot of them are interconnected. Some of them are not. Under each town, under each village, under specific neighborhoods, sometimes there's a single tunnel that connects two different networks. So it's big, it's complex, it's based on how they understood the needs that they would have when an enemy, mainly the Israelis, come into Gaza, how they would fight them. And so it's a big, vast thing. The official Israeli estimate is between 20 and 40% is destroyed. That's a big range, 20 and 40%. And it reflects the fact that since going in, they've discovered sections and areas and scale, tunnels large enough to drive a car through, that the intelligence understood quite a bit about the tunnels, but never imagined that. And so we discovered just how much Hamas has built and how astonishingly large that project has been. The seawater point is really very important because it's an engineering coup. It's actually a tremendous engineering success. We have managed to flood a small number of tunnels in ways that won't hit the aquifer, won't hurt the drinking water, and will actually make those parts of the tunnels uninhabitable. It's the safest way for the Israelis to flood tunnels that we've yet found, and they're looking for many more ways to do it. The point is, it's going to be a long time. It's going to be a long grind in Gaza with a guerrilla war, a counterinsurgency. It's going to be painful. It's going to be frustrating. and it's still going to happen.
We're going to come back and talk about that, but pause for a moment on the engineering. There is very little detail about that. What do we know about what the Israelis are doing and where they're doing it and how I know they have to protect the aquifer, and they are doing so very, very carefully, no matter what the International Court of Justice says. But where are they doing it, and what do you know about it?
Very little. We know that they have laid new pipes to enable it. We know they've had to choose areas to pump it in. We know they have to think about gradations. Obviously, water flows down. These tunnels are a complicated network of also, they're in 3 dimensions, right? It isn't just, you don't just create a 2-dimensional map of how the tunnels work. They go up and down as well. And so it's this incredibly complex thing. The military has devoted special unit with interdisciplinary from many different professions in the military, engineers and specifically water engineers and explosive engineers and all these different kinds of units. There are special operations to go in and take over areas of tunnels that are useful for the experiments that they've conducted in flooding, and those have been special military operations on the ground with special units. And so it's been this incredibly complex project that they devoted a huge amount of resources to, because if they can at will flood any part of the tunnels they want, they have to some significant extent solved the Hamas problem. And so the army is moving forward on this in a big way.
When we come back from break, we're going to talk about time frames and about how long Americans ought to expect and what Israelis expect the conflict to go on. I'm saying we're going to be talking about this a year from now. Haviv will be back here talking about this in a year from now, but we'll find out what he says after the break. Stand by, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt. Welcome back, America. I'm talking with Haviv Rettig Gur. You can follow him on X at Haviv Rettig Gur. You can also go to the Times of Israel. Haviv, I am preparing for this to go on for a long time, but the American political season has begun. Joe Biden clearly wants this to be over, and there are lots of headlines and head fakes. How long do you expect Israeli troops to be operating in Gaza?
I mean, in a fantasy world in which everything goes well and we get everything we want, we get our boys home, Gazans get to start rebuilding as soon as possible, 6 months. In a real world, it's going to be a year and more.
I'm thinking 5 years. My father was in the occupation army of Imperial Japan, and he only did 8 months after the war, and then he was demobilized. But we were there. MacArthur was running it for 5 years, really basically until the South Korean conflict. Is anyone thinking realistically about how long Israel is going to have to stay there and get shot at by guerrilla forces?
I mean, yesterday the defense minister in public, in a public speech, said it's gonna be a long time, and after Israel won't control civilian issues in Gaza, it won't control Gaza, rule Gaza in that sense, but it will have security control for a very long time. And under that Israeli security control will be the rebuilding, and that's something that is pretty clear. And as you say, that could take 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. The aspiration is to pull Israel out as quickly as possible. Hamas is gone. Moderate Arab world forces come in to not just rebuild, but de-radicalize. Hamas has run the education system for 17 years, and half of Gazans are under 18. And so half of Gazans literally were taught by Hamas. Those UNRWA schools are the majority of employees of UNRWA, and Hamas approves them, and the curriculum is in some importance, to a very important degree, set by Hamas. And so there is a process of de-radicalization that also has to happen in Gaza, and rebuilding, obviously, and all of that. So, the intensive war fighting will take months. The counterinsurgency, the low-level counterinsurgency, much longer. And the rebuilding process will still see some Israeli involvement. So I don't think 5 years is crazy. I hope that 5 years isn't a war, because that would be something. No,
more like Iraq and the United States. Now, the Philadelphia line, Egypt has objected to Israel taking it over formally, but they actually don't object, do they? They'd rather you ran that than them, don't they?
Egypt's position is very complicated. They're desperate for Hamas to be destroyed. They're desperate not to be left holding the responsibility in the eyes of the Arab world for the humanitarian crisis. And so an Israeli push to the Philadelphia line itself, which is the Gaza-Egypt border, would compromise the hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, civilians, now essentially who fled the war zones of Gaza and are basically trying to sit out the war in these safe zones. Those safe zones would become the battle zones. And so Egypt is very scared of that, wants Israel to understand that, and doesn't want to be seen with, battles between Israelis and Hamas under the watchful gaze of Egyptian soldiers on the border who do nothing. It doesn't want that imagery. And so Egypt wants Hamas destroyed, absolutely, and is very scared of the damage to Egypt, politically and diplomatically, and internally within Egyptian society. There's a lot of anger at Egypt and a lot of anger at Israel. And so all of those problems exactly make them play that complicated game of wanting Hamas destroyed, but pretending to be against the Israeli war effort.
Now, Haviv, I've read enough to know that the Muslim Brotherhood is not going to be destroyed by this conflict, and that Qutb's writings are not going to go away. When I hear people say that ideologies can't be destroyed, I think of Nazi Germany and Japanese imperialism. In fact, they can. Is it not possible to eradicate the Qutbism that is that branch, the fanatical Wahhabism? Is it not possible to eradicate that?
It's such a good and critical question, and it's so hard to know how to even begin to think clearly about it. My sense, and it really is educated guess, no more than that, is that Israel doesn't know how to do that. You use Douglas MacArthur in Japan as an example. Douglas MacArthur was basically the dictator in Japan. He arrested journalists. And Japan understood that it had been defeated. The radical militaristic branch of Japanese politics and society understood that it had been defeated because of the nuclear explosions in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Here we have a situation in which Israel cannot run Gaza the way the Americans ran Japan, not for that length of time, and not with that same kind of political structure. And also, Israel is too much the enemy to be something that teaches Gazans a different story. That is not, Israeli Jews don't know how to, de-radicalize a Sunni Arab population. The hope, and it's not just our hope, it's the hope of the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Egyptians, is that these regimes, these governments, these countries like Saudi Arabia itself de-radicalized Saudi Arabia. Right after 9/11, they were caught, on their hind legs. They were very surprised. But then, after the two bombings that followed on Saudi soil in 2003, the Saudi government said, "All right, we've created a Frankenstein's monster. We've been funding these radicals." They turned on them. They shut down madrasas. They arrested imams. They de-radicalized their society. They might be able to come to that.
Hopefully, they will. Stay right there, Haviv. We got to talk Israeli politics in our last segment, which I will replay for the radio audience in the next hour. Don't go anywhere. I'm Hugh Hewitt. You're listening to The Hugh Hewitt Show. I am back now with Haviv Rettig Gur for our last segment. Haviv, I saved Israeli politics for last because I don't understand it at all. It seems to me that Netanyahu is widely disliked, but he also has a grip on 4 years in power that is not going to be dislodged because the far right's not going to do it, and he knows how to play this game. But I also hear a lot of politics creeping into the podcasts from TOI and the Hartman Institute and the other ones that I listen to. Can Israel keep politics at bay long enough to at least get 80% of the fighting done?
No. That was an easy question. I say that tragically, but Likud's campaign is back. The Twitter campaign accounts are back. Netanyahu is actively talking to political factions, negotiating, campaigning. The campaign is in every way except literally funding an actual campaign apparatus, which they're almost starting to do. The campaign to survive is back. Netanyahu has been talking a lot about not having a Palestinian state. That is not mainly meant for American audiences or European audiences. That's mainly meant for the far right. Netanyahu's been warning for the last 3-4 weeks the far-right factions that blame him for October 7th, right? Because he was the prime minister, and it was his Gaza policy that brought October 7th. And so if you're, the religious Zionist party or the Otzma Yehudit party or those parties to Likud's right, you don't see a big difference between Netanyahu and the center left. And they've been saying that. Even though they're coalition partners, they've been saying that. And Netanyahu's response is, I'm the only thing preventing a Palestinian state the day after, because the Biden administration, the Europeans, are allies, the people helping us fight Hamas. Once we destroy Hamas, they're going to say, now give us a Palestinian state, and I'm going to prevent it. Netanyahu isn't talking about that because it's good for Israel right now to talk about that. He isn't talking about that because he's actually, because I don't know what the center left or the centrist leader Benny Gantz is actually going to establish a Palestinian state. He's not. Nobody knows what Palestinian could establish a Palestinian state in the next 10 years. He's talking about it as part of that campaign. So I think not only have politics returned, I think politics have begun to some extent, still in the margins, but nevertheless to some extent to shape the war effort.
Has everyone retreated to their partisan corner? Now, I haven't heard it very often. Your host of the Times of Israel avoids it. Occasionally, one of the guests will mention Netanyahu, and the contempt in their voice is complete. And I think that is very dangerous for the TOI podcast, because you don't want to lose your audience. It's got to be enormous. It's a straight-up news show. Does every Israeli talk politics on every corner about how do we get rid of Netanyahu or how do we save Netanyahu?
We have pretty good polls, and no matter how you ask the question, and no matter which direction you come from, they tell the same story. One poll we said, it wasn't a Times of Israel poll, but it was a significant poll by a significant media outlet. Do you want Netanyahu to survive, to be the prime minister who is still in power after the war is over, after everything's over? 28% said yes. That's not great for Netanyahu. We also have a poll about public trust, where a pollster asked, they took the 4 top leaders of Israel and they said, do you believe this person is primarily focused on the war or primarily focused on politicking? Defense Minister Gallant is the most trusted man in Israel right now. He got 90-10. 90% say he's working on the war, 10% politicking. Benny Gantz from the opposition came into the government to stabilize the government, 80-20. Very good numbers. Netanyahu, 65-35 the other way. 65 say he's politicking, 35 say he's primarily focused on the war. So the distrust of Netanyahu is profound. I have to tell you, conservatives feel betrayed by him to a profound extent within Israel. In the hierarchy of command on October 8th, on October 7th, every single person in that hierarchy has taken responsibility except Benjamin Netanyahu.
I've noted that.
The Chief of Staff of the Army, the head of the Southern... I have seen a 26-year-old captain on TV asked about that and saying, some of his soldiers were killed on October 7th. It's my fault, he said. Only Benjamin Netanyahu didn't. And so
is there a way where...
on the left.
Is there a way where Likud splits? Gallant says, I'm going to bring down the government, I'm going to run as a new party, and I'm going to take as many Likud members as possible, and we're going to force elections. Is that what happens?
I don't know. We have polls right now that show Netanyahu losing seats to the center, quite a few, and also losing seats to the far right, quite a few, and Likud shrinking by almost half. Those are his worst polls. He has better polls than that, but the worst polls have in the past come true once in a while. And so there's a deep, deep distrust in his constituency. Is that enough to split the party in two? Honestly, I don't know. I am absolutely convinced that when he runs, he hasn't won an election poll in a year. He really is not positioned to win this thing. And he's going to try and stick it out until the spring of 2025 in the hope that he can.
Well, yeah, that makes the most sense to me, is that the war goes on. You don't hold an election in a war. And that he wages war to win, not to do a deal, because it's the only way he survives and because it's in the best interest of Israel. But I still see, at some point, Gallant, who is very impressive, saying, I am done with you, and Likudniks come with me. Is that discussed openly?
I think it would. I haven't seen it discussed openly. He is the leader. Gallant is probably at this moment, which again, it's a war. He's the defense minister. Maybe that's why. But at this moment, he is the top choice for replacing Netanyahu in the sort of chatter among the Likud ranks. Does that mean a rebellion? I don't know. A lot of Likud, huge numbers of Likud, want Netanyahu gone already. It's gotten to the point where it's Thatcher in her final year. It's the cost of having him far outweighs the benefit. But Likud has a culture of loyalty to the leader that is astonishing and has been a huge advantage for Likud over the decades. Likud has had exactly 4 leaders since 1948. And so if it does oust Netanyahu, that'll be the first time that the party does that.
I did not realize that. They've had 4 leaders. One of them was Begin. Another was Shamir.
Begin, Shamir, Sharon, and Netanyahu.
Oh, my gosh. That is not a great deep bench, is it? Haviv, I do not want to abuse your time by the side of the road. Could I keep you for one more segment?
Sure.
Okay. Thank you very much. Stand by. I'll be right back. America, don't go anywhere. When I come back with Haviv Rettig Gur on The Hugh Hewitt Show. Morning, Glory, America. Bonjour, hi, Canada. I'm Hugh Hewitt in the ReliefFactor.com studio. As you know, for the last half hour, I've been talking with Haviv Rettig Gur of the Times of Israel. I'm also joined by Mary Catherine Ham of Getting Hammered podcast, and you see her on TV as well. Good morning, Mary Catherine. How are you?
Good morning. I'm good.
I'm talking with Haviv, and I wanted to see if you had questions after my last question for him. Haviv, in terms of when it all falls apart, in terms of the politics of Israel, when they can't put off elections anymore, when do you expect that to be?
Great question. Technically, it could take a year. They have to pass a budget in a year. There isn't any specific thing that would fell Netanyahu except the right-wing parties literally deciding to topple him. That's why he's on a Palestinian state campaign, because he's telling them, if I fall, there'll be a Palestinian state within a year, and you'll have a ideological catastrophe. And so don't leave me, even if you blame me for October 7th, even if you think I'm terrible, leaving me will cost you. And so the far right would be actually the deciding factor. The only other possibility is protests. We have seen some limited protests of hostage families. We have not yet seen the mass protests of all the tens of thousands of Israeli families of victims of October 7th. And when that begins, if that begins, 86,000 Israelis haven't been home in 100 days because they're evacuated from northern towns and villages as everyone waits for the Lebanon war. If those people who are displaced, the people who are the family members of victims, start marching in the streets, that's hundreds of thousands, and that could just force the government to resign anyway. So
the key point there,
those will developments of it.
You said is as everybody waits for the Hezbollah war. Mary Catherine Ham, we cannot find the Teddy Roosevelt or the Carl Vinson on our map this morning. The United Kingdom is sending an aircraft carrier to the Red Sea. We've already got the Dwight Eisenhower in the region. Do you expect a regional war, Mary Catherine?
I mean, it's feeling more and more like that. What concerns me is that the way that you prevent regional wars is that you react strongly at the smallest provocation from Iranian-backed proxies, and we have decided not to do that. We decided long ago after the Afghanistan withdrawal that we were going to cede much of this ground and much of our power, and I think that becomes very dangerous. I know the left will tell you all day long that displaying strength will cause a world war, and yet the Soleimani strike did not, or moving the embassy to Jerusalem did not. It turns out that displaying weakness causes some of these problems.
Do you expect a regional war? By that I mean including people other than the IDF in the combatant status?
In the immediate term, no. Iran has shown us that I tend to agree with what Mary just said, that strength does deter in the Middle East. The Middle East is not Western Europe. It works differently. It has different cultures. It also has different politics and just different ways of interacting. The very fact that Iran and Hezbollah have done everything they could while pretending to fight Israel, actually sitting out the Gaza war, tells us, I think, of some of that is fear of America. Even in America, that won't use its strength is immensely strong. And so we have seen that there's that care and concern. At the same time, I have to tell you, everybody on the ground expects a larger war in Lebanon, too. And not only are 86,000 Israelis have left their homes on that border, 100,000 Lebanese on the other side have also left their homes. Those are mostly empty villages in South Lebanon right now. And so the chances of the war at least expanding to Lebanon, and from there, who knows, are quite high.
Mary Catherine, what do you think Americans expect out of this conflict? Are they paying attention in the way they were on 10/8, or have they backburnered it? And although 3 American soldiers got killed by an Iranian drone, and I blame Iran for that, they're not ready to go to war. I really don't have my finger on this pulse yet. What do you think, Mary Catherine?
Yeah, I'm unsure. I think some people care. I think obviously the loss of American service people matters a lot and makes people pay more attention. Do I think that people are interested in war? Obviously, that's what people are clamoring for. However, I think the sort of bellicosity occasionally of the Trump administration was fine with people, right? It wasn't nation building, it wasn't boots on the ground, but it was strong response to provocations, and that was okay with voters. I wonder if I could ask,
please,
is Netanyahu correct that without him in this particular government that there would be a move toward a Palestinian state? Is there actually appetite for that and will to do that in Israel?
Haviv?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. There's first of all, the opposition is made up mostly of people who have woken up on October 7th to the understanding that until Palestinian society is profoundly de-radicalized, the idea of pulling out of the West Bank and shrinking Israel down to 9 miles wide at the middle, while Hamas controls the highlands, which Hamas right now would win an election in the West Bank, is so impossible to imagine that no, Gantz and Lapid and the people who potentially could be prime ministers could defeat Likud in an election, absolutely can't, even if they wanted to, and I don't think they want to, even if they wanted to, couldn't deliver a Palestinian state right now. And that's what makes it all harm to Israel, positioning it that way, while it raises the cost to Biden of helping us by talking that way about a Palestinian state, while not actually securing us from any threat that could be down the road. That's my view, at least.
So, Haviv, to follow up on that, if nobody wants it, how does Netanyahu campaign on it? If no one is actually saying, I'm going to deliver, I mean, Israeli voters are like American voters. They know what's going on. How long does the ruse last?
I think it's a desperate Hail Mary on his part because of the polls, because of what everyone knows. Everyone is reading the polls everywhere in the world. He gathered together the Likud Knesset faction, the members of Knesset of his party, about a month ago in a room, in a closed-door room, which is why we know everything that happened there. If you want everything to leak, you close the doors. If the doors are open, nobody cares what's happening. But so he gathered them together and he sent to them what is basically his political strategy. He said, Gantz will give Biden that thing. The Biden administration will come to Israel and it'll say, we just paid a lot of political capital for you. We have a rebellion on our left flank. Give us that Palestinian horizon. Give us something where we can go back to the Democratic Party and say this was good for Palestinians in the long term. And Gantz won't stand up to that pressure, and I will.
Mary Catherine, I have a domestic political question for you.
Yeah.
I think the Jewish vote in the United States and the vote of the Friends of Israel from people like me who are Catholic and support Israel and people like you who are evangelical and support Israel, I think this is going to realign American politics because Biden is walking back support for Israel. Do you see that, Mary Catherine?
I don't want to set my hopes too high for such a thing because I feel like it can be fool's gold often. However, I have heard, certainly anecdotally, I haven't closely enough at polling, but anecdotally among friends, particularly Jewish friends, who wouldn't necessarily normally consider voting a different way, are certainly disillusioned in a way that I have not heard before in the past. Now, does that last through 2024? I don't know, but there's so much discomfort in that coalition for a Jewish voter who thinks, well, I was your ally for so long on so many issues. I would think the demand for allyship was so high and I did so much and I was so vocal, and yet here we are and I'm suddenly the enemy. And that is a very uncomfortable feeling in your voting coalition.
So I'm going to let Haviv go after this question. Mary Catherine, ask you if you can stay one more segment. Haviv, yesterday the Post ran a story, or the New York Times, on black pastors turning on Israel and suggesting that Jews in America are not on the same page as they are. Do Israelis, do they feel obliged to support Biden even though they know he's undercutting them, or do they really believe he's with them?
I'm going to answer not the Israeli elite. The political elites have strong views, and they're also partisan, and some connect more to the Republicans and some. But I'll tell you what ordinary Israelis think. When President Obama was elected the first time, he had huge favorability in Israel, hitting 70%, somewhere around there. And when President Trump was elected for the first time, he had huge favorability in Israel, 70% approval. Israelis don't entirely we speak Hebrew amongst ourselves. We're a little bit of a There's a Freudian slip. We're a little bit of a parochial country speaking an obscure language, right? We don't entirely understand America's culture wars. We love America. We love America because we know better than most what Pax Americana has meant, the free world and a prosperous world that America built for everyone in the world after World War II. That's the thing that Israelis feel connected to. And so President Biden will, unless he makes does something that Israelis feel is genuinely against them, which happened a couple of times in the Obama administration, will enjoy tremendous support and love, and so will any Republican president. It's about America, not so much about the specific political faction in America.
Haviv, I want to thank you for spending a half hour with me. I'm going to ask Mary Catherine if she can't stick around to comment a little bit more on American domestic politics, particularly that Kamala Harris is going to be our next president comment that Nikki Haley made yesterday. But Haviv, thank you. Follow Haviv at Haviv Rettig Gur on X. Read thetimesofisrael.com. You can become a supporter. You don't have, it's free. Times of Israel is free. I read it every day, like 20 times a day. But it's free. I should send them $6 a month. I haven't yet. But timesofisrael.com. Follow Haviv Rettig Gur. Listen to him on Dan Senor's Call Me Back podcast.